Today we have the honor of having Jonathan Atkin, one of the great tech analysts of our industry and of our time for the last 20 years. And actually, I'm very honored that we share the alma mater. We both went to Columbia together years ago. But Jonathan has been one of the key analysts on technology and data centers in specifically over the last couple of years. He's been the guy to read whenever you want to find out something about new trends in digital infrastructure. He's 20 years with RBC, and we're very, very fortunate to have Jonathan here today to talk about what he sees happening in the markets, and also, what his view is on as we start to look out into the future. What'll be some of the signs that we'll start to see that the industry is shifting. And so really, really excited to have Jonathan here today, and welcome to the PTC Digging into the Future series. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thanks very much.
Now, do you see, the big question that always comes up, especially at PTC and a lot of these conferences around, obviously the big five also now are building their own cables, and they're building their own data centers. So they build their own, essentially, hyperscale centers. Do they, in the future, just become their own infrastructure providers?
Yeah, I think you're going to see kind of a bifurcated architecture. And that has been the case for probably the last 5+ years. There was a time when Facebook was the biggest leaser around, and then they pivoted towards building their own data centers, and it wasn't clear that they necessarily needed to be in third-party sites. But since that time, whether it's Microsoft, Google, IBM, Oracle, Amazon, there's parts of their architecture that are going to be more storage operating centers, a term that I think you've used in the past as well, it's going to be very uniform. It's storage arrays. They're going to build their own in places that have low total cost of ownership, cheap power, where latency isn't critical. But the production sites that need to be close to the GDP, you're going to want to be in a third-party environment, a campus where other cloud providers are. Customers are going to expect that. Multi-cloud, I think, is a real thing, and so not every company is going to be reliant on one CSP partner. So there's going to be a vested interest on the part of many of these big customers to lease in a third-party environment. And I would say that some of the biggest leasers are also the biggest builders. The one does not come at the expense of the other.
Okay. And what do you think about, we've heard this new trend out there, and obviously we used to talk about forward operating centers and storage operating centers, but now there's a real official name. It's called edge data centers, and they seem to be the up and coming thing. What's your view? Do you think there's a sort of a bifurcation of the data center industry? And they also talk about something called micro edge as well. So do you think there's, and do these data center companies become focused on one segment of the market, or do they play in all the segments of the market going forward? I mean, what do you see happening with these sort of the bigger platforms?
Yeah, I think there'll be some companies that have kind of their own natural swim lane, being in the major GDP centers, and then a farm league of companies that are maybe first to market in a tier 2 city in North America, or a tier 2, tier 3 emerging market within Asia. And then, of course, there could be M&A that happens on the back of that. But I do believe that some of the biggest sites the biggest hubs out there, barring any constraints around permitting and things like that, they're going to get bigger. And then these emerging hub locations will get bigger as well. So one does not come at the expense of the other. When it comes to micro edge, I'm not sure that there's a well-developed business model there, at least as it pertains to kind of a neutral host model. I think there are cases where, at the factory floor, at the enterprise premise, you're going to need an AWS or Azure compatible box. That's going to be kind of a hardware sell, that the enterprise, essentially purchases. And then bandwidth connecting back to the public cloud. But the role in that value chain of a third-party data center operator, I'm not sure that's really established at this point.
One quick question for you also, just thinking about emerging markets today. If you think about data centers, really, I have a chart that I often use, which shows the population of data centers. And when we look at it, they're Western Europe, the United States, and then what I would call the developed Asia, so sort of Japan, Hong Kong, Singapore have got very, very high concentrations of data centers. But then when you go to a lot of the emerging markets, there might only be 3 or 4 data centers in the entire country. And to be honest, most of the big players have avoided those markets for the most part. You look at they'll put a toe into China maybe, and you're starting to see a few guys moving into India. But for the most part, the big players have not touched those markets. Unless I'm missing something. I mean, how do you see them, and do you see them playing a role in the emerging markets, or is it you think they'll just continue to focus on their sort of core developed markets?
So the focus on core developed markets, as long as there's the capacity to further develop, I think will continue. But getting to what we talked about in our edge discussion earlier in this conversation, I think you will see more and more investment in emerging markets from some of these folks. A lot of it will be kind of GDP driven. Some of it's regulation driven, but on balance, the greater the GDP, the more likely it is that a given country is going to start to see, one of these big five start to kind of pay attention, either through partnering with a local telco, building their own environment, or perhaps partnering with a third-party data center developer to add capacity. But it's in many cases, as long as it's a sizable GDP that's growing, it's a question of when, not if.
Okay. So just to finish up, Jonathan, as we look out into next 2 years, obviously we've had a nice run on most statistical levels for whether you be a mobile operator, a fixed line operator, or a data center guy. What do you see? How do you see the next 3 years? Do you think we're on a nice run, or do you think that there'll be a slowdown or a reset after sort of COVID goes away and people get back to sort of a normal way of life? Or maybe they never go back to that way of life. What's your thoughts on how the next 3 years look?
I mean, a lot of it depends on access to capital, right? But as long as nothing, unusually disruptive happens in the capital markets, and as long as the drivers of IT outsourcing and internet usage, bandwidth, social networking, software as a service, cloud computing, gaming, as long as those continue to see the types of growth volumes that we've seen over the last 3 years, I wouldn't expect any dramatic change in course and speed over the next 3+ years.
Okay. Well, that's Jonathan Atkin coming to you from California. This is Bill Barney on Digging into the Future, and thank you all and thank you, Jonathan, for giving us your insights. We really appreciate it, and look forward to seeing you hopefully in Hawaii in a few months' time.
Great. Thanks a lot.